So good morning and welcome. So this week we're going to expand on what we talked about last week. Last week was chaos and complexity. And this was the idea that there are kind of two forces in the universe, and from the humanist perspective, they're sort of our ideas of good and evil. So chaos is the tendency of systems to fall into disorder, right? Entropy. And complexity is the necessary condition for human existence, right? We have come to be in this place and time through a random set of circumstances that happen to create just the right conditions for us to live. So if we're going to consider our continued existence, we have to consider what are the required conditions for us to continue to exist. And so in examining the idea of human existence, what if we're not existing as a whole bunch of individuals that exist on the planet, but actually as a superorganism comprised of individuals that are all tied together for their continued existence? And I liken this to how our cells work in our body, right? We have many cells. They all do very different functions. Sometimes they compete, right, to make sure that the organism as a whole survives. So what if we, as individuals, all have our part to play in the continued existence of humanity? It's a different way to think about our existence, and I think it's one that might be beneficial for us to consider. So we're going to kind of break down some of the philosophical ideas behind it, and then how it might manifest itself and how maybe it's useful for us to consider. So if you're into science fiction, which I recommend that we will all be into science fiction because there's a lot of great philosophy in science fiction, Isaac Asimov's Foundation series really explores the story of this idea of humans as a superorganism. And if you're going to read the Foundation series, make sure you read the prequel to it first, because the rest of it makes more sense if you read the prequel first. It was the last book he wrote. Read it first. But it gives you a really great idea of what humanity might look like tens of thousands of years into the future, and what might happen in terms of how we consider ourselves. And so when I talk about humanity as a superorganism, I don't mean that we should all be exactly the same. In fact, that's not how superorganisms tend to work, right? Like the cells in our body, they all have different functions. They're specialized. They're diverse, right? And some are specifically meant to compete, right? So you've got your T cells and your macrophages in your body that detect and eliminate things that are harmful, right? So cancers or cells that have gone awry. And so these variations are all kind of mutations on the same basic function, and they can be good or bad depending on the circumstances and the time in which they exist, right? So I was having a conversation the other day with a friend of mine, and we were talking about the need for competition, right? We're programmed to be competitive and warlike creatures, right? And that evolution occurred because of the pressures that existed at the time. So for our tribe to survive, if something was impinging on our ability to get food and resources for our tribe, we had to go fight whatever that was, whether it was predators or another tribe. And so that need to compete kind of for the tribe, right, and go out and put your individual self at risk and possibly sacrifice yourself is something that was advantageous to us. And I think still is, but in a different sense. We still need to have that drive to compete, because without competition, we fall into comfort, right? And comfort precludes growth. But the way our competition, I think, manifests today causes us to use more of our back brain than our front brain. We need to take that competition and kind of elevate it to the next level. So we're not competing now for our individual resources or even our tribe resources. We're competing now for the resources that are going to sustain all of humanity. If you look at the resources available on the planet, there are enough for everyone. Right? Doesn't mean that we all have it accessible to us, because that's clearly not true. There's a significant amount of difference between those who have and those who don't. But the resources are there. So what we're doing now is conceptually is trying to marshal all the resources we have on this planet to make sure that we can sustain our existence, ideally, into the infinite future. So that means things like sustaining our environment that we have and getting off this planet so that we have diversity, right? If one planet gets struck, the other one still exists and humanity continues. So that's the level of competition we're at, and our instincts that we're programmed for don't help us in the way that they currently manifest when we're fighting each other for political ideology or who's the most outraged about something, right? That's where that drive manifests today. It's still there and it always will be. And we always should have it, because if we ever get rid of it, if there's ever a point in the future where we need to compete, then we'll have lost that edge. We'll have lost that tool from our toolkit. So there's a balance to be struck between maintaining the tool and then using it well and not against each other, because it's as if we're using it against our own body. So one of the reasons I think that we're really part of a superorganism is because we are social creatures, right? We require each other to exist in a functional way, right? One human is not humanity. And even probably two humans is not humanity, due to the degradation of the gene pool if there were only two humans, right? So maybe a tribe is enough for humanity, but we require more than one of us to exist. So when I think about that, it makes me wonder if I should be considering humanity a little bit differently. Not as all the other people, but as these are all parts of myself. And I think that's beneficial. And so one of the other great stories that's out there is called The Last Question, also Isaac Asimov. And The Last Question is a story about humans evolving into a singularity. I won't get into the specifics, but it's a very great story. It's very short. And I think in a way we're already evolving into that singularity, because think about technology as a shared consciousness, right? We all have access to all of Wikipedia, to most of human knowledge, to each other, right? We know what other people are at least saying they're thinking about, right, in terms of social media. Those are all really powerful tools that can help us better understand our fellow humans and humanity as a whole. Now, we don't use it in that way, I don't think, very effectively. Right now, I think we use it still to highlight our differences. But those things, I think, are a step toward this shared consciousness, this evolution toward a singularity. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we're all going to be one merged hive mind. I think there's still a desire and a necessity for individuals to be autonomous, to think differently, right? That, again, supports that idea of diversity and optionality and having people with different solutions that may be more optimal. But if we can better understand our circumstances, we can make better decisions about it. Because when we're thinking about the threats that face the world today, climate change, I think, is one of the more immediate ones. What we need to do is figure out our environment. It doesn't matter what's causing it, although I think we basically agree that humans are causing it and accelerating climate change. But even if it were unknown, it benefits humanity to understand what is happening. And so our best course of action in any case is to advance our knowledge of the situation to the point where we understand the consequences of any solution that we're going to put forward. Now, we're never going to have perfect knowledge, but our knowledge should be as good as possible when we're talking about altering things like the climate of the globe. So to me, that pursuit of knowledge and that collective pursuit of knowledge so that we can understand the consequences on each other is the best way to go forward. So I want to break from that for a moment to go back into a little bit of philosophy, because this touches on some certain ideas about theology, right? So people of different religions, some believe, and particularly Christians in the West, believe that God will take care of the world, right? There's this idea that, well, it's meant to be. If it's happening, it's meant to be. It's God's plan, right? Or in Islam, God wills it. Though there are passages, particularly in the Bible, that talk about humans have to take care of the planet that God has given them. And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people bring up Pascal's Wager when they're talking about who's going to take care of the planet and if we should just pray about it or if we should do something about it. And I think it's something that we have to hold in front of us because, again, if we're all part of the same superorganism, we need to understand how the competing parts operate. So some people interpret Pascal's wager basically that a rational person should live as if God exists and seek to believe in God, because if God doesn't exist, that person will only have a finite loss, right? So they lose some pleasures and luxury in life, and then stands to receive an infinite gain represented by eternity in heaven, right? And that, again, avoids the infinite loss of being in hell for all eternity. Another reason this is important, because if this life is finite, but the afterlife is infinite, then it doesn't really matter what happens to the planet, or to your children, or to anything else, because if they're all going to live happily in the afterlife, then that's okay. A little bit of suffering is worth it for the infinite afterlife. And people use this as an argument to say, well, you should believe in God, because clearly, if you're going to make a wager, a short-term loss for an infinite gain, that's a good wager. There's a couple of problems with this. So one, Pascal never intended it, or according to some, Pascal never intended it to be, you should then believe in God. He posed it basically as a thought experiment to say, based on these conditions, this seems to be a logical conclusion to come to. But one thing is it only accounts for an individual's wager for their lifetime, right? It only works for me in the decisions that I make, because in making this decision, it may cause me to act differently in my life. And it doesn't account for the idea of humanity as a superorganism, because it changes. So the one wager is like one hand in blackjack, right? Or one hand in poker. But poker is a strategic game where you're playing the other players. You're not playing the specific cards. So to me, it's important that you are accounting for the wagers in the entire game. And the game, to me, is the survival of humanity. And I'll talk about that when I talk about humanity's wager in just a second. But if again, your life is finite, and if everybody, or at least the people that most of us associate with, we all think our people are going to go to heaven or have the rewards, right? That's how we work. We work in terms of tribes. Then again, that changes your calculus. Well, it doesn't really matter if I cut back on the things that I need to do to be a good Christian or a good Muslim or a good whatever, right? I'm still giving my money to the poor, I'm still supporting the church, I'm still doing whatever things I think I need to do, but I can still have my big house and my consumeristic way of life in America, all those good things, right? But then what happens is humanity as a whole degrades because we're making what I would consider to be a faulty calculus based on our individual wager of our life, as opposed to a collective calculus, right? So it's almost like the prisoner's dilemma, right? Where if both people cooperate, they both get off free, and then they're better off. But some of the time, people are going to take what's theirs so that they get off or get a lesser sentence, and then the other people are going to suffer more. So if we considered that, and we didn't operate by this logic, by Pascal's wager, or at least what people are interpreting it to be, then I think we end up better off in the end. And it also, so one of the other things that's amazing to me is it causes us, I think, to discount the decisions of people who came before us and the decisions that will come after us, right? A lot of people in the world today are like, oh, the people before us made bad decisions and that's why we're in the problem we're in today. And that's true. But then we continue to make those same bad decisions because we don't want to bear the discomfort and the suffering to curtail our own activities to then create a better future going forward. So I'm going to talk about humanity's wager. This is something I came up with when I was looking at Pascal's wager. I'm like, well, what is the longer term version of this? What is humanity's wager when we're talking about the existence of what I would call an interventionist God or interventionist deity? So these are the four conditions. An interventionist God exists and will maintain the earth for the future of humanity. So that's infinite gain. An interventionist God exists and will not maintain the earth for the future of humanity, for an infinite loss. So it's basically saying it's on us as humans to take care of it, but there is a God that does exist. Third condition is an interventionist God does not exist, and we run out of resources before we leave this planet. And that's an infinite loss. And an interventionist God does not exist, and we marshal our resources to leave the planet and provide for our continued existence. And that's an infinite gain. So we've got two infinite gains and two infinite losses, because we're considering all of time and all of humanity, not one single bet. So the only good conditions are either there's a God that exists that's going to save us no matter what we do, and we're good to go, or a God does not exist and we save ourselves and we're good to go. So I argue in favor of condition 4, that an interventionist God does not exist and we have to marshal the resources to save ourselves. The reason I argue this is because we cannot prove, at least not using logic, the tools that we have available to us as humans, the clear existence or non-existence of God. Therefore, we should operate in terms of our overall survival as if God does not exist. Doesn't mean you have to believe or not believe in God. That's an entirely different subject that is more contingent on the individual. But we have to operate it as if no one is going to save us except us, because we only know the confines of this existence. We know we live, we know we die, we know our time is finite. Therefore, our time should be dedicated to continuing our meaning that we impart as individuals into the overall stream of human existence. Most of us that manifest fairly concretely in terms of our kids, right? I want the world to be better for my kids than it is for me, because they're part of me, and it's a little bit narcissistic, right? That's a little part of me and I want it to continue. But if that's the driving factor, if that's the instinct that causes me to do good things, well, then that's probably a beneficial instinct to have. But it's not just about my kids, right? If I keep my scope there, my kids are probably going to be set. They're born in America. We have a fair amount of resources for our family. They're probably going to be just fine, probably for the course of their lifetime. But what about their kids or their grandkids? Do I want to impart the suffering on my children to watch their grandchildren suffer? No. And so I have to expand my scope to include all of humanity, because we're all on the same planet together. I mean, if you shrink it down, it's like 6 people in a lifeboat, right? They're all in the same lifeboat together. If somebody's dumping water into the lifeboat, that's bad. We should probably have a conversation about that and figure out how to come to a conclusion that helps us to survive. So to me, this idea of humanity's wager, again, isn't about the belief that God exists or doesn't exist. It's not even saying that God exists or doesn't exist. That is irrelevant to the existence of humanity. People can believe whatever they choose to believe because, again, I believe people need a framework to understand life in the world. And for some people, that might be something that exists outside of us. That might be a comfort that they need to exist. I'm cool with that. But when it starts affecting their calculus and starts ruining the potential for human existence, that's where it becomes concerning to me and where a conversation needs to be had. So that's the wager. That's humanity's wager. And that's the way that I interpret it. I think we should act as if a God does not exist, or that God isn't going to intervene and we have to do something about it. So there's a great quote from Marcus Aurelius that I think relates well to this. It goes thus: "Live a good life. If there are gods and they are just, then they will not care how devout you have been, but will welcome you based on the virtues you have lived by. If there are gods but unjust, then you should not want to worship them. If there are no gods, then you will be gone, but will have lived a noble life that will live on in the memories of your loved ones." And that, to me, I think sums up very well what it is that we're after. We can't prove or disprove the existence of a God or someone else's God or the God of this or that religion. So we should let those things be and live the good life that's required for our existence. So what do we need to do then to set the required conditions? Because to me, that's all it's about. It's not about who's right, who's wrong, who's won, and who's lost. It's about the required conditions. So we need societal stability. That's one. And we can reinforce that through systems, processes, and engaging in politics as the individuals, because that's our responsibility as part of the greater humanity. And that means having hard conversations about what's going to work, not who's the most outraged and who wants to win the most, right? I get it, that's that competitive instinct coming out in us. We need to figure out how to wield that to say, I want humanity to compete the best. How do we do that together? So how do we get people to understand that? So this is kind of step 2 to that first one. Education, training, and using the front brain, the things we talked about last time in terms of maintaining the complexity necessary for human existence. We've really got to focus the front brain to get out of responding defensively to someone saying something stupid, or focusing on me first, tribe first, right? You always have to do that to an extent, right? You have to look at things through your perspective, through your lens, through your tribe's lens, but then try and branch out to see how do we make things good on the whole, on balance? Because humanity's existence isn't a zero-sum game, right? It's an infinite game. And to play the infinite game, you have to be focused on making the game go forward, not winning specific rounds. So the next thing is environmental and conservation, in this idea of not consuming, in terms of a virus or a parasite, the host. So we need to get smarter about how we're using things, how we're reusing things. And really it all comes down to energy. So we got to where we are today in the industrial era because of oil, right? The reason oil was necessary for us to advance so quickly is because of the energy density of oil. And I forget the specific numbers, but it's like 34 to 1. 1 unit of energy to extract it and 34 to use it, to burn it, to do things. And we've gotten more efficient with our use of that over time. Nothing else comes close to the energy density of oil. So if we don't figure out a way to convert other sources into energy, and an energy that's fairly dense, again, to get us off the planet, then we're not going to be able to do this again. Or at least that's a theory, right? That's a theory that we're not going to be able to get off the planet if we don't basically come off of this high of industrialization. That's our launch point that gets us high enough to the stars that we can get off of this planet. And if we do not take advantage of that timing, there's only a certain window that's going to allow us to do so. The last thing is more individual and is more cultural, and that's accepting discomfort. We've come to a point in our human evolution where we have, particularly in Western society, so much comfort that it's preventing us from achieving things. It's easy enough to land in a job that can sustain your existence and your family's existence. And that's not to say that that happens to everybody, right? It doesn't. There's a lot of disparity. But relative to all of human history, it's easy to land in comfort, particularly if you're in a Western society. Comfort precludes growth. If we're not struggling with something, it's much more difficult for us to make ourselves do the hard thing. This is something that we have to take into our minds and sit with a little bit, that I'm going to have to accept discomfort. I'm going to have less. I'm going to have to walk more or bike more or eat fewer cows, whatever it happens to be for you, whatever your discomfort is, right? And that's going to be tough. And it's going to be something where you have to really focus on it on a regular basis. I know this is going to suck, but I'm going to use my front brain to overcome that rear brain programming that says eat more sugar, right? Whatever it happens to be. You've got to go out and find your way, right? These are just some ideas, but you've got to find the things that you think are going to advance humanity's survival chance. So the call to action, the simple thing at the end of this that I think is important is to, I'm going to quote the Bible, love thy neighbor as you would love thyself. The reason that's important is because it's not love them as you would yourself. Love them because they are part of you. And that can be hard because people are dumb sometimes. I get it. So what we have to do then is say, I might have been there once. I might have been that person at one time. How do I give them a little bit of understanding so that they can come with me on the journey and they can be the person that helps me advance humanity? It's going to be tough. But it's incumbent upon us to take that first step, right? So next week is our 1-year anniversary. So the 17th of June last year, we actually started our first service. So next Sunday is the 16th, I believe. And so we're going to celebrate with a discussion of where the church is. So I'll do a kind of a very short talk about what our ideas were for the church, some of the things that I found to be interesting, and then we'll go off camera and we're going to have a good conversation about what we want the church to be. What do we want to do with this? This is our humanist church. This is not my humanist church. There's no pope of humanist churches, right? So what do you all want this to become? Because I think that's how we bring humanity into the future, is by taking ownership of the systems and the groups to which we belong. So with that, thank you all very much for coming, and we'll see you all next week.